All right. Good morning. Well, it's not really a good morning. I wasn't initially going to stream this morning, but a lot has changed in the last 24 hours. Well, not changed. A lot has happened in the last 24 hours, and to the point it's dragged some of the largest streamers, commentators online out of temporary breaks in order to cover aspects of what's happened. Um, the first thing that was sort of captured people's attentions from a few days ago was the incident in Charlottesville in late August. And then there were questions not only about why it took place, but why it took weeks for everybody to get to know. Hold on a sec. So, yeah, there were questions there about why it took so long for that news to come out. And the rather brutal and sad video footage that accompanied it and the bystander effect that was going on, and there's a lot of questions to come out of that, not just the perpetrator, the incident itself, but how people respond and react to situations and how it differs compared to uh, highly publicized situations elsewhere, and the role of the media in stoking flames of division, which, yeah, never good. So there was going to be, I wasn't going to talk about it initially, but seeing some of these other commentators suddenly pop back out of semi, not retirement, but out of their breaks to cover it, it seemed that there was a couple of stories. Well, yesterday's story, last week's story, was enough to really break through a whole lot of barriers and really started tongues wagging. And then sadly, the shooting that took place, well, this morning, our time, but overnight in the US, in regards to a conservative commentator who'd go on to college campuses and stuff like that and debate ideology. Basically, he wanted people to convince him of their points of view, as in hold open, honest debate about, well, points of ideology, points of economy, points of a whole bunch of things. Um, and yeah, the I don't know that there was much of a threat beforehand, but there are obviously a lot of very, very upset people and um, a lot of rage building. And we'll sort of go into that. Also, look at something that surged yesterday morning as I finished stream. It happened and faded away really quickly, but we got into it on stream last night a bit and sort of whilst playing Pillars of Eternity, my party stood there doing circles, waiting for me to move them to the next task. But there was a lot of discussion about what was going on, and quite obviously, there's certain feelings within parts of Europe about what's going on. So, look, before we start, before we go into the the sadder stuff, we'll hit some more of the more generic stuff that we've already talked about in the last few days, stuff that doesn't make people upset. I think you can see the reading list there on the right, what it talks about. Um, so the politics stuff or local issues with universities. Now, I alluded to a few times in the previous streams about the difficulties that a variety of Australian universities are facing, and one in particular being the ANU, Australian National University. Now, back in the day, it started out as a research university and sort of really only took on students to allow it to fund its position doing research. Obviously, that's shifted a little bit over time. Its law department has generated a number of very significant politicians and prime ministers over the years. I think at least two PMs have gone through the ANU law department as students, and ANU tried to position itself as like the premier Australian university, mainly research university. In recent years, it suffered um, economically. COVID didn't help. Loss of overseas students didn't help. Declining enrollment numbers didn't help. There was a period of expansion and infrastructure development that, in hindsight, was probably ill-advised. And now attempts to claw back the damage are leaving the staff very, very upset. And so there's been almost a revolt within the university between the worker bees and academic staff and the council that heads them up, the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor. So the article that popped out this morning was that the ANU Vice Chancellor, Genevieve Bell, is expected to resign as a result of all of this. Whether or not it's going to make any difference, I don't know. The uh, the council, headed up by um, former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, had appointed her in 2023. So there'd been a fair bit of ire targeted at Julie Bishop as well for uh, the role that she'd been undertaking, and obviously there's a link there to uh, some of the issues surrounding her tenure in managing the university. And so it's been causing all sorts of issues. I mean, in order to try and fix the sinking financial ship, they try to cut loose a whole bunch of staff, and that went down like a lead balloon. And then, as people got more and more upset with what was going on, it became more apparent that there were things at management level that probably weren't the best, conflicts of interest, all that sort of stuff. And so, at least it's been suffering as a result. And um, as it says there, March they had a vote of no confidence against the board, basically, and in regards to leadership and job cuts. And I mean, when most of the college deans say it's either you or us, well, it's probably the only thing that will save the the system. Now, uh, it's obviously going to be more to come over time with that. I mean, people are saying, well, if they get rid of Bell and get rid of Bishop, all things are going to be great. Uh, systemic problems were a bit before that. It just so happened there were some very high-profile issues under their guidance, um, and yeah, uh, as the commentator there says, it's indicative of what happens when you run out of money and try to put a managerial class in to run things. Yeah, to some degree. I don't know that academics are necessarily best placed to make business decisions. I mean, they certainly can make the best academic decisions about research targets and things like that, but there needs to be a balance. It's a bit like in software development, game development. Um, Having a very enthusiastic game developer develop games is one thing, but having them actually run the business side of things is another. And you'll see people complain online about how the business side of things suppresses the creative side of things. Well, you need incoming funds to fund the creative side, and so some people can do both, a lot of people can't, and there needs to be a managerial oversight. And the issue, I don't know so much, I wouldn't say so much, is that there's a managerial class. Well, yes, I would in some respects, but that they've handled the ANU rather poorly in this case. And things like COVID and reducing um, student enrolments certainly exposed the weaknesses in the system. Now, it might have been in the past they were able to paper over things and hide some of the, not some of the losses, but absorb losses or the weaknesses in plans and methodologies and things like that. But when you're down to the bare limits, any deviation from the ideal solution is going to cost you. But at the same time, there is no way to identify the ideal solution. You're going to find um, that there's no one right answer, but there's a lot of wrong answers. So yeah, it'll be it'll be interesting to see what comes out. Personally, I don't think it's going to be enough to right the ship. Um, Even if Julie Bishop departs as well, I think it'll be circling the drain for a while. It'll probably require all new blood. And I think that was part of the reason why Julie Bishop was brought on, is that she was new blood. She was sort of outside the system and was sort of seen as an external influence who'd be able to help attract funding and right the ship and everything else. And that didn't quite work out the way it was intended for a variety of reasons. So here's hoping at least one of Australia's major universities can sort itself out, but there's whispers that it's not the only university having issues like this. And yeah, it's I mean, I just said that whoop, as this commenter says, it's probably the start of a path that we will see many other universities around Australia follow at some point. Um, and yeah, the loss of full fee paying students is an issue. We'll see. We'll see. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know who they're going to put in place. I mean, I'm sure they're going to find somebody who appears good on paper. Uh, Hopefully, they'll be all good on the ground as well. And at some point, some of these cuts are probably going to happen. Yeah, it it's if the system's resisting. I mean, systems resist change by their very nature. It's going to be interesting to see what happens next after that. So yeah. All right. So that's that one. Uh, Next one is something that popped out about house pricing and stuff like that. We talked about yesterday about the increase in the first home ownership grant. Well, not FOG, that was a different grant. In the government run first home buyers program, which was the 5% deposit and no LMI, and the them raising the caps on the value of property that could be accessed by that program, because obviously as prices went up, the number of available properties that a first home buyer could access through that program got fewer. And the figures given in that article were quite surprising. In Adelaide, for example, it was a fraction of the available suburbs under the current setup, but with the revision to valuation of it that is accessible, all of a sudden the majority of suburbs were now available for first home buyers to move into or to access the system. But you're still looking at, even with a 5% deposit, in general around Australia, you're looking at a loan up around the six to $700,000 mark, and the cost to service that at the moment is high, even though the interest rate is quite low. The capacity that a lot of people will have to pay that back will be difficult, and even to still gain a 5% deposit based on the incomes listed, we're still looking at 2 to 5 years to put that money away. But I mean, if people want to get in, they need to get in. And so this article popped up through the Sydney Morning Herald, but basically on Domain, which is the real estate side of things, basically saying that the cheaper houses are getting more expensive faster than the more expensive houses. And you're looking at, um, so Perth has climbed pretty much 20, so for the lower price end of the market, has climbed almost 20% in the last 3 years. So this is well and truly post-COVID. Uh, that's quite a bit. Now, Perth for a while was overpriced because the fly in, fly out workers for the resource sector, for the mines and gas and oil projects up in the northwest, they have a house in Perth and fly back there, etc. So there was a lot of money coming in to a limited housing supply, so that drove the pricing up. As the resources sector sort of slumped, then money fled the market, and so things corrected somewhat, and the pricing came back down. But compared to other cities, Perth was kind of seen as a bit of an overheated market. But I mean, the resources collapse has passed, and the sector's doing relatively well again. So again, 20% increase, that's quite a lot. Uh, I mean, Melbourne and Sydney, like, okay, Sydney being the most expensive market, it's only climbed 4%, but the average house price in Sydney is now pretty much $1 million. You're talking an entry level house is, well, depending on the suburb, you'd be lucky to get a freestanding property for anything less than 6 to 700,000, and that's a small place. And in some far out suburb, you're better off looking at a unit or an apartment, maybe a townhouse. But even then, the prices are very strong. Yeah, but still, 4% when it's 4% of $1 million is quite a bit of money jumping up. But yeah, Sydney had a bit of a decline last year, and people were forecasting, oh no, it's going to be a market-wide decline. Well, again, the people forecasting are the ones that had interest in it. So yeah, they're saying it's a bit odd because it's the cheaper houses is driving the market as opposed to the higher end. And tying back into that first homeowner stuff, the affordability, the availability of affordable housing stock is difficult, particularly in the cities where available expansion is constrained, i.e., Sydney, Canberra, um, to the main extent. Melbourne, Brisbane, Darwin, Ad, well, even Adelaide. Adelaide's constrained too. Um, Melbourne, Brisbane, Darwin, Perth still have directions they can expand in, but the other cities have either geographic limits or planning limits that limit the extent to which those cities can physically grow. And yeah, the this is a statistic that no one finds surprising, that home ownership amongst younger people is a lot less than it was in the past. The whole idea of mum, dad, 2.4 kids in a house, well, all of that has kind of gone by the wayside. And so, uh, Gen X, the later half of Gen X, less likely to be homeowners than, I guess, their parents. Again, not a surprise. And the issue here is half of what you bring home, so after tax, is going towards servicing mortgages. Now, when I was saying that, yep, the cost to pay off a six to $700,000 loan is quite excessive. Now, when the average income they were talking about for the first homeowners thing was like $120,000 or $140,000 combined, um, you're not talking about a lot of capacity. Cost to pay back a loan of that amount, you're looking probably, well, north of $1,500 a fortnight is the minimum repayment. That's a not insignificant chunk of what you bring home. And then that doesn't take into account all your other running costs. And little wonder people are dipping into superannuation and other sources to try and get the money to get into the property. And I mean, I wonder how much the difference is with people moving towards units, apartments, townhouses compared to freestanding houses. We'll see. We'll see. And it also doesn't say whether this is outright ownership or with a mortgage. I don't think these figures are outright ownership. I would be very surprised if uh, half of this cohort own their properties outright. Um, I think very few people below the age of 50 own a house outright, and even then, a lot of people into their 50s are paying it. The one person I knew who managed to pay their house off before they turned 50 had used their resignation payout from they did I think 20 years in the Navy and used their retirement payout, resignation payout to basically pay most of the mortgage off. Actually, I don't know if they paid their mortgage off fully. And the other people who I knew who did it were 20 or 30 years older and had sold their properties at the right time, and did have an investment property, but had now consolidated down to the one place and poured everything into paying it off. So, yeah. So obviously, yeah, I mean, the graph there shows the same. That basically, the further up the line, the older the cohort. So you're looking at, uh, your boomers, your late boomers, late boomers, into your Gen X, starting into your Gen X. So they're increasing. I mean, as they get older, more people are owning it, but they were not owning property when they were younger. But it's sort of collapsing now for the much younger cohort because their salaries aren't getting them enough to get into the market. So yeah, October 1, we'll see how it changes. But yeah, that that looks awful if that's supposed to be a an auction or an open house. I mean, great for the vendor, not so great for the people trying to get their foot in the door. But I don't know. I don't think that's the case there. So yeah, that was that one. Kind of related to that was an article that came out about what people need for what's deemed a comfortable retirement in terms of their superannuation. It When I was a kid, I don't know that superannuation was really known by many people. I think most people were looking either to a workplace pension of some sort or an eventual transition on to the government pension at some stage, and that it'd be a combination of the two, taking them through their retirement. And retirement was still definitely a thing, and uh, yeah, that they were looking at maybe 15 to 20 years of retirement before they hit the average age of an Australian. But they chances were they probably owned their own house by that point, and so were unlikely to be renting or leasing or otherwise like that. But there were obviously people who fell through the cracks and were in insecure housing, and the the idea of the impoverished pensioner who was limited with what they could buy and eat and all that sort of stuff. Obviously, since then, superannuation definitely grew as a concept and what people are sort of looking to retire with. And I think most people are trying to retire with a super amount and use that to fund their future lifestyle rather than relying on the old age pension, which is not really that much. It shows that, well, question is, how likely is it that people at age 65 are going to be retired? Um, Certainly, I think early Gen Xers in the cohort where 65 is still their retirement age. Depending on some jobs, it might be as early as 60. But by and large, as the generations have gotten younger, as we've moved forward in time, the retirement age prescribed through various superannuation schemes has climbed. And I think some of them you're looking at 70 odd. And even if you can access your pension from or access your super from 60 or 65, there are taxation disincentives, we'll go with that, that basically try and discourage you from drawing down on your super too much. Now, as I briefly mentioned about the housing, there are people who are drawing down on their super to get housing deposits and things like that. So they're looking at 75 grand for couples and 53 grand per year for singles, which means close to 700,000 in super to afford the retirement for couples and 600 for individuals, not counting. Um, Hold on a sec. The key here is that the expectation is you own your property. We just covered an article talking about how likely it was you're going to own your property if you were paying a mortgage by 65. And the, well, expectation from some people to use their resignation payouts to finish off their mortgages or be forced to downsize and use the equity that they've built up to pay out whatever's left owing. So who knows how much it'd be for someone who was renting? And yeah, uh, it's interesting. Now we talked the other day about the difference between CPI figures or inflation figures and what the experience is. Well, I mean, they said the overall inflation rate, the growth was like under 2%, but right there it states that in the previous quarter we've seen increases in energy costs and private health insurance that have exceeded that. And well, don't know how much the cost of fruit and veg counts, but still. And yeah, I mean, chances of getting to that point, I don't know. I mean, even going into aged care, if you go into residential aged care, there's a whole bunch of different ways that it gets set up. I mean, your daily cost for someone going in aged care is hundreds of, well, in excess of $100 a day for most places, and that's a fully subsidised position. If you're not in a fully subsidised position, you can be paying $500 a day because there's a contribution that Centrelink slash Services Australia will means test you on, but that is capped. So after 3 years, that goes away. But that doesn't take into account the actual cost to secure the position, secure the room, which it comes down to an accommodation fee. Now, if you pay that out, right, you could be looking at in excess of $600,000. There's probably not a lot of people entering aged care who have those sort of funds readily available without pillaging their superannuation or other income streams. And even then, if they have to sell their house, and a lot of people pretty much expect to have to sell their house when they come into aged care, uh, how long is it going to take? How long is the house going to sit on the market before the funds become available? And until the funds become available, then you're paying the daily rate, which is non-refundable. And yeah, you'd almost be looking at needing $1 million of available funds in some form or another to enter a residential aged care facility without breaking the bank. And yeah, it's mind-boggling how much this stuff can be. And when you've got an obligation to try and look after the estate, if someone's under management, you can kind of understand, well, you don't agree with it, but you can kind of see why. You can see the articles about the public trustee and guardian having to basically liquidate somebody's estate while they're still alive in order to secure enough funds for them in an aged care facility or some other care respite facility. And then if they ever manage to get out of those facilities, it's like they've got nothing left. Well, that's because it cost almost $1 million to get you into that facility, and not a lot of that money comes back. Well, depending on how you pay the accommodation fee, it might. It's, yeah, I think that's one of those hidden costs that are going to become more apparent as the population ages and more people try to, well, I mean, the goal of the My Aged Care system is to get people to age gracefully at home through home care packages and infrastructure support and things like that. But then that goes back to the problems we've been talking about in previous days about the lack of infrastructure, the lack of support services, and that's just for a younger, healthy population. You then need mobile services that can go into people's homes, provide that level of service and support, and have sufficient capacity to support multiple aged people in the community and that sort of thing. And those sort of things bring insane burden plus insane costs. There's not, I mean, the further you live away from the capital cities, the harder it is to access these sort of services. Even the capital cities can be lacking in some of them because it's one of those things that there's always a shortage. But the idea is to try and get people to age, spend their retirement and their elder years in at their own home. But again, that attracts costs and everything else. And unfortunately, for some people, that can't be the thing. But even the aged care system is sort of struggling somewhat. I mean, there have been articles about attempts to boost it, and I mean, the intent behind it is fantastic, and I mean, it's a great idea. Just unfortunately, not everybody can do that. So, yeah. But I mean, it suggests that a 30-year-old, with a nice age bracket, seems to have been covered for a few other things, suggests that they're probably on track to achieve that $600,000 super figure for retirement, but they've got another 35 years worth of work, so they can achieve what's a comfortable retirement. now, but in 35 years, that figure's not going to be $610,000. It's probably going to be closer to $1 million with increases in inflation, cost of living, etc. So, yeah, a median wage employee at age 30 right now is probably not going to hit a comfortable retirement figure based on just on these figures. It's sort of they kind of ignore what the future cost is going to be. Yeah, it'll be it'll be interesting. All right, next article. Okay, so I can get rid of that. We talked about that. We talked about um, we talked about the house prices, and then there was an article I didn't talk about anything. Okay, uh, we'll go the flotilla for Gaza because this is kind of a lead in. So the flotilla for Gaza, the one with Greta Thunberg on board, claiming that they got hit by a drone off Tunisia. Well, it looked like they're actually in the harbour in Tunisia. The footage that people have seen and looked at sort of suggests that it was possibly a misfired flare from on board the vessel more than it was some sort of incendiary being dropped from a yet to be determined drone. Some of the stuff where they were complaining about drones overflying them earlier was because they'd entered territorial waters of other nations that weren't quite sure who or what they were, so had gone out to have a look, kind of to be expected. But if you were to listen to the people on board, it was some sort of major existential threat to what they were planning to do. And so the first vessel kind of on fire. Now, the second attack in as many days, I think this is still the same vessel that was, I think this is the same case about it burning. And one of the things that sort of stands out is, okay, they've got a vested interest to play up the danger of what took place or to play up there being a big, scary agency chasing after them. And therefore, it helps raise funds because people feel bad about what's going on, all that sort of stuff. Well, the the truth is often hidden about what goes on. Now, the fact that they had footage from on board the ship of what was happening kind of led people to quickly go, actually, that looks like a flare more than anything else. It doesn't look like something was dropped from another thing. Now, um, yep, the Tunisians said, look, no, what was claimed was wrong, and um, they've obviously decided they don't like Israel at all, therefore it's all Israel's fault. Now, we're going to be looking at, as we go through the rest of these articles today, the problem of damaging inflammatory rhetoric and how it's now leading, has unfortunately led in the last day or so to some very sad outcomes for some people. And there needs to be a rationalisation. There needs to be a bit of self-reflection by people who are pushing a lot of this rhetoric. They need to stop and consider what happens if people commit to action of what they've said, and or whether they are willing to accept the consequences for actions or basically even for their own words. Are they willing to accept consequences? Don't know. Um, they're basically blaming Israel for reaching out and doing it. Um, as some people pointed out, if Israel was going to reach out and attack something like that, the ship would not have been hit by something so small. There would have been a far more substantive outcome. And so misinformation spreads, and I mean, let's take Trump's statement from his first period in power as president, and the idea of fake news. Well, it clearly seems that the incidence here is likely fake news. People have people without the experience to understand what's going on have made rather salacious claims, and because they're the ones who are there, it's then been taken and run as gospel. It's a bit like sometimes when Sea Shepherd was heavily engaged in a lot of their activities that they were doing. Now, if you're not aware of who Sea Shepherd are, they're kind of like a more militant organisation focused on protecting the seas. They like to go after Japanese whaling fleets in particular, and I'm sure they've had a few other bits and pieces that they've targeted, but that's the one they like to be known for. And they're not about peaceful protest necessarily. They quite happily will throw butyric acid, the one that smells like rotten butter, um, onto the whaling ships. That they'll try to foul them with dragging lines through the water, try to interrupt the harvesting of the whales, etc., and will come very close to committing piracy under international law. And so that tends to obviously upset people, and it also attracts a type of militant environmentalist who sees that as appropriate action. The sort of environmentalist that will throw um, ground up pigs into pig feed that are into pigs that are before pigs and sheep are headed for export to Islamic countries, live export. So it stops the live export because the animals have now had contaminated feed, but also as an attempt to have the receiving nation refuse them because they're no longer able to treat it as a halal product. That sort of thing. It would be like when the Rainbow Warrior was protesting French nuclear testing in the Pacific. That is considered peaceful compared to something like Sea Shepherd. All right, so something like this, where they're making an attempt to intentionally antagonize a sea blockade and things like this. Yeah, that's the sort of thing it seems like they're going for. They're going for that more extreme attempt and seemingly lack detailed understanding of laws of the sea, of national border security, I guess. And, well, I mean, there's no problem saying you've got support for a given people. Not an issue. But, yeah. um, hmm, that figure looks odd because I saw a UN figure the other day suggesting that the death count in Gaza was only on the order of 1,000 people, yet Gaza's health ministry says over 64,000 have died. Okay, those two figures don't quite line up. And the first figure came from the UN. So, not that I trust them much either. Uh, but it's it's almost like the statement that came out recently about um, international genocide scholars have declared genocide in the Palestinian territories. And many news articles ran with it and said, oh, look, this is the gospel truth, where this is right, bad Israel and everything else. Very, very, very few stopped to consider what the source was, stopped to consider what or who the international IAGS were, International Association of Genocide Scholars. It turns out it's a random organization that people can just pay $30 to become a member of, and then that designates you a genocide scholar. And so they had an internal poll, and three-quarters of their respondents said, yes, it's a genocide. Now, I will give credit to them. They were open enough to identify how their membership voted. And so you're able to see, if not the outright ethnicity of who was voting for what, but at least get a rough guide as to the breakdown. So, was it all European people? Was it all Westerners? Was it all uh, people from Middle Eastern countries? Like, were there trends in how people had voted? Yeah, yeah, there were. But the funny thing is, none of the media that ran with it seemed to have the moral integrity to identify the relative strength or weakness of the source. Now, it was telling that it dropped out of the media cycle very, very quickly, which suggests that at some point somebody went and had a look and went, this isn't a very high quality source. It was like, now I might get the organization wrong, but I believe it was Human Rights Watch. It's either them or somebody named very similar to them. For many years, it was a single person who was Human Rights Watch, and they were not present on the ground in any of the conflict zones or areas of unrest that they were covering and making the claims about. They were doing it from their own house in England and basing it on the media coverage that they'd seen, and I guess some of the reports coming out. So straight away, the limit of what they could accurately identify depends on the validity of the information receiving and the quality of the reports and coverage and everything else, which straight away is slanted. But because they had a decent sounding name and had sort of hung around for a while, they started gaining traction as a voice to be heard in this regard. It, it was one of those things where even a cursory look as to who they were sort of was like, well, why do they have the credit that they do? I mean, if I was to listen to somebody explaining something about issues with migration, refugees, even illegal migration, I'd listen to the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. They are, well, they've come out of um, they've come out of, well, initially World War II, the migration patterns out of World War II. I think initially they might have been Red Cross or Red Cross aligned, but eventually they evolved to become the IOM and are a fairly formalized body. I mean, they help process refugee camps, they help process refugee claims, they help identify people who are likely to lodge refugee claims or identify people who are migrants in the process of migration. They've certainly helped in valid migration periods, and they've also been present with um, people who be classed as illegal migrants. Their political slant or what they do exactly, some people may not like it, but they have respectability because of the decades that they've been involved doing this. And so if they say, oh, there's 20,000 people sitting here who are likely to attempt an illegal border crossing, yeah, you probably want to listen to that because it's probably been verified by going and seeing them, going and visiting them in whatever camps or sites that they're waiting on, and going from there. So yeah, it'll be interesting. Now, obviously, they finish up again the ABC article. We know which way they lean. It says, oh, yep, the Israeli naval forces boarded and seized a British flag yacht back in June. Well, that was because they crossed the blockade line. Going to happen. It happened a few years ago with a Turkish ship that was attempting the same thing. People shouldn't be surprised by that. All right, so I think that's the only article we had on that. The next one was, again, another historic, well, not historic issue. In fact, we'll go to the Nepalese issues, where the protests, where, yep, um, 22 people, 19 people, depending on which source you read, were killed in recent protests. There was footage unsourced on Twitter that I saw of them actually throwing politicians into the river. That was kind of funny, but unfortunately unsourced. But the fact that they've now set fire to the Parliament building and other government buildings, there's a lot of anger. Now, yes, the government of Nepal has been very, very unstable since the overthrow of the monarchy, and yep, the government has basically collapsed as a result. Then the impetus, which most people agree on now, it was, and I mean even at the time, was the ban on social media. I don't know whether countries like the UK and Australia and the US are paying attention to this, because they're attempting to make various bans on people from around the place. I mean, Australia is introducing a ban on social media for those under the age of 16 with effect start of December, I believe. The UK is obviously rolling out their Online Safety slash Surveillance Act at the moment, and they're engaged in putting people through the criminal justice system for statements that they've made online. Now, I will take a little sidebar there. People saying, well, that's a bit weird that they're arresting people for seemingly non-violent rhetoric online. I believe that this is a bit of a hangover from, well, probably back as far as Henry VIII, but the idea that there is certain speech that is considered banned. There is certain banned speech in the UK. It's not a new thing. Uh, yeah, you could probably draw a long line all the way back to the um, dissolution of the monasteries, the establishment of the Anglican Church, and so on and so forth. But when the Troubles were on in Northern Ireland, there was quite clearly certain speech that was not permitted. It would have been regarded as insightful, not insightful as in that makes good sense, but it would have been considered inciting people to violence or acts of hatred. Uh, it would have been, I mean, you wouldn't have walked down the Shankill Road saying certain things, even if it wasn't illegal. You probably would have encountered social pushback because you were saying things that shouldn't be said in a place that shouldn't have been said. And yeah, yeah, people kind of went, okay, yeah, well, Northern Ireland kind of makes sense. They try to sort of keep the peace, and you keep the peace by saying, look, don't say stupid things. Well, saying stupid things, being told you can't say stupid things, means that you've got banned speech of some degree. The one that, well, was a bit more surprising to me, but was not Northern Ireland, is in Scotland, where public transport, I saw photos from on public transport, which basically said that there is certain speech which is banned speech. And this was to do more with the, I guess the expression of it was through sport, Celtic Rangers rivalry. I won't know exactly which one is which, but one of them has a predominantly Catholic supporter base, and the other one was predominantly Protestant. Okay, well, the wars of the religions ended ages ago. Why is it still a problem? Well, it's um, football violence or supporter violence has been a thing for a while in Europe, but there are soccer teams or football teams around which certain communities gather, or they're more associated. There's some really quite racist supporter chants, particularly in the Netherlands, where some of the teams are associated with Jews, and so supporters of other teams will target it with anti-Semitic chants and things like that. But back in the UK, because of the sensitivities and the risk of football, of hooligan violence associated with the derby and basically whenever Rangers play Celtic, that there are certain things that you're not allowed to talk about or not allowed to say openly because it would be considered an attempt to incite violence. And so there is banned speech. Okay? Kind of makes sense when you look at it that way. It's like, yeah, we want to let people say whatever they want. But when it's clearly a term or a phrase or words being used to encourage people to violence and it has historically resulted in violence, yeah, I think most people will say, yeah, okay, fair enough. Don't say that. But it's counted as banned speech. So we look at what the UK is currently doing. Most people see that as an overreaction. They don't see it on the same level as as a supporter group riling up another supporter group and encouraging them to punch on in the streets or stab each other or anything like that. So they see the rhetoric a bit different. They also see the rhetoric going from being football hooligans who were not necessarily broadly represented throughout society, but you're now seeing people being arrested or being targeted who would never have been associated with that stuff in the past. And it's, I guess, eye-opening for some to realize that words and actions have consequences, but it's also people saying, well, maybe the consequences for this, which is not maybe in inciting people to violence, is overstepping bounds, is that we're pushing too far, or that it's suppressing valid debate and dissatisfaction with what's going on. And so everyone's like pointing at 1984 and all the other bits and pieces as an attempt to suppress. And yeah, obviously people feel that given how the internet was sort of started becoming available to people and what people could do online, of course they're feeling like their rights are being quashed somewhat. Again, I don't know whether Australia and the UK and the US are taking a lot of the message away from what's happening in Nepal. I don't know that it's going to get to that stage of violence. Uh, I don't know that you'd say the governments in those other nations are as unstable as they are in Nepal. Now, France, when they lost their PM the other day, had massive protests all of a sudden. Now, they weren't tied to the fact the PM got sacked, they were coincidental. But uh, there's this undercurrent of, hmm, there's a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the people, which is now bubbling up and being shown in many different ways. And I think there's a lot of governments out there that are more concerned than they're letting on. So yeah, the obviously they've brought the army in to try and squash things. And whilst it started about a ban on social media platforms, it's now sort of evolved into a more of an anti-corruption stance, almost like Occupy Wall Street kind of started out. There was another protest not long ago, another series of protests where it started for one reason, but the broader dissatisfaction was brought forward, and people went, "No, this is the reason now. This is what we were always upset about, and is now the reason for the protest continuing." So, yeah, people are unhappy. not not everybody can magic a completely stable country after transition from a royalty or anything like that, or even, I mean, even stable countries can go through massive periods of political unrest. Yeah, it's issue. I mean, fake news, hate speech, and online fraud. I mean, they're the standard things that get trotted out. Mm, yeah, it's it's certainly interesting. I mean, that was the BBC talking about it. Um, that was the Nepal Parliament set on fire article. So yeah, obviously they brought the army out to run it. Now they've claimed now that the protests are being taken in different directions. Well, they kind of are, but people are now say that they're now targeting corruption. It, I mean, it doesn't help when you burn the building down. Bit hard for people to be on your side then, or looting and being violent. I mean, okay, disruption attracts people who, well, black bloc type protesters, anarchists, who are like, alrighty, game on. But yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily call it a revolution, but yeah, they're continuing. And I think a lot of people weren't really aware of the degree of instability. Sorry, excuse me. The degree of instability in Nepal. I think there was another article I think I saw. Yep. So the ABC News had it as well. But yeah, again, talking about it, I dare say it's probably largely ABC and the BBC. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, it should have a byline at the end. They tend to have a byline at the end. ABC with wires. So yeah, it's largely come off the wires stuff. But when you look at what was banned, I mean, I can understand why they got upset. Hey, maybe we'll see 16-year-olds riot here in Australia when that sort of ban kicks off in December for them. Don't know. Don't know. And yeah, we'll see. Okay. A quick sidebar. Again, we're talking about protests and things like that. The Banksy mural that appeared. Now, it the the stencil art, the protester being beaten down by the judge was a Palestinian supporter. Was I think it was Palestine Action was what it was supposed to represent. And that was the group that had the 500 to 600 people arrested over the weekend. And I think that sent a bit of a shocking awareness through a lot of people in that bucket of support who suddenly realised that their prior actions had led to consequences, and they got all up in arms saying it was a suppression of speech and everything else to arrest people for it. Well, you're being arrested because people under your group or under the banner of your group had trespassed on military sites and damaged military equipment and had basically taken the next step up in terms of in terms of violent destructive action. And the government was like, no, 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 we're not having that. Now, Banksy could have put pretty much the same mural up at any point over the last probably 18 months, and people would have understood it on a more general basis in terms of protests about migration, in terms of protests about um, the ability to represent what they feel England stands for, the people to represent an identity, and how they feel that that is falling away from what is available now. But no, 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 no. Banksy has a very clear political position, and he's a big supporter of the Palestinian people. I don't think there's any secret to that. But the whole covering up, the way it's been covered up, the his most recent artwork's been covered up, almost further exemplifies why, well, the message that he was trying to send through the artwork. It's um, almost sending a stronger message than the actual picture was. Now, the poor bloke cleaning up here is wearing a helmet and a mask to protect his identity. I don't know that he's necessarily going to be targeted for that. I think people understand this guy has very little say in what he's been told to do. I don't think people are necessarily going to blame him. Well, up until the last 36 hours, I would have thought that. Right now, I couldn't, wouldn't be able to trust it. But yeah, they'd also blocked the picture, and it was like they'd taken the worst possible steps to deal with it. Um, and I guess when people engage in, I guess, effective street art against the justice system, against the political class, that's when they get upset. I I don't know. Um, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, that's a lot of people to be arrested. I yeah, did think that was kind of funny when I saw it. I when I talked previously, and I'll now segue into, I guess, talking about Ukrainian issues. But when I was talking in previous streams about the observed shift in public focus away from Ukrainian issues towards Palestinian issues, and the idea that people seemed, for the protest class, seemed to only focus on one issue at a time, and that I'd picked this trend up by watching European sporting events and seeing from 2022 how the nature of the flags being waved changed. And suddenly the blue and yellow flags of Ukraine vanished almost completely to be replaced by people waving Palestinian flags. And how the push for Palestinian statehood isn't anything new. It comes and goes in cycles. The issue here is that this is not the first time protesters have disrupted a Vuelta España stage. Now, I don't watch the Vuelta España. I watch more the Giro and the Tour de France. But um, the third of the big classics, the third of the Grand Tours is the Vuelta, and they've already had one stage cut short, and or they've adjusted the finish line, and I think they did that once in the Tour de France as well. But in Spain, they've already had at least two in this one tour, which obviously causes nightmares for the organisers, causes issues for the riders. It's a safety issue, and I mean a time trial that's been shortened to half distance now becomes almost a sprint, I guess. Um, but because of pro-Palestinian protesters. And it's, well, yeah, if you keep disrupting the race, people are going to go home. Riders will go home. And that then raises the question about, well, what are you achieving with a protest? You're interrupting a major sporting event. Well, and it's a major sporting event. You're making, I mean, it's probably the least patronised of the three tours, of the three grand tours. It's just not helping attract viewers or eyeballs or interest and therefore money in the tour. So yeah, it's it's an issue. I mean, as I've already said, they've shortened. I mean, I knew they shortened the 11th stage. I didn't realise they'd shortened the 16th as well. But um, and I didn't realise that had protesters actually stopped the race at one point. It's frustrating. Now we're going to talk as we move forward, and you can see there's plenty of articles lined up about the problem of the rhetoric that is slinging around at the moment and the ideologies pushing it, and how I think there's been a turning point. as such in the last couple of days. I mean, a turning point. Well, what happened to my VTuber then? Anyway, a turning point. Yeah, in many ways. But this is sad to see. And I mean, I doubt many of these people could even find Palestine on a map beforehand. It's just, yeah, I mean, as the writers say, they're being caught in the middle of something that doesn't even really involve many of them. There is a team there that is sponsored um, the by Israel, but there's also teams in the Pro Tour who are sponsored the by Arab countries, UAE Emirates. Yeah, I still think they're UAE Emirates. I think there's a couple of teams that might have Saudi sponsorship as well. I mean, the riders will go and ride the tours and the circuits where they can. And there's certainly early in the season they have. I think it's the Tour of Oman is one of the big races that's sort of like a build up. It might be the level below the Pro Tour, uh, but basically where it's the feed in level to the top teams. They'll go and ride wherever. I mean, they ride the Australian Tour Down Under, they ride Tour of Langkawi, the World Tour, I think, is the name of that level. Um, People will ride where there's an opportunity to ride. They want to compete. They want to be their sports people. They don't like the idea of having their events interrupted because of some protester who's protesting something that they didn't know about 2 years ago. But it's been going on for decades. So, yeah, we'll see. Um, and because it's an Australian article, it's talking about um, the Aussies riding, but yeah, kind of sad to see. Not just because I like watching um, the Grand Tours, but they're probably one of the few major sporting events where supporting the general public can get so close to the competitors, and that's almost by design. And it'd be sad to see the tours disappear because a group of people couldn't control themselves. So yeah, the the lead off from that. Now we won't jump straight into that one. Okay, Nepal, we've covered that already. Um, we have, since we're talking, I mean, we'll talk more about protests and things like this. They're expecting them to have more protests this weekend with different ideological groups coming out, and sadly, it seems that you're going to have extremists such as the NSN show up. Yeah, see, among the groups expected to rally are members of the NSN. Now, I don't know if they're going to be formally represented or not, or just people there. Um, I don't know what the ideology of the first group is. They're the Australia Unites Against Government Corruption rally. I think everybody kind of would be in favour of that. The Save Australia tally, good job, Channel 9. Save Australia rally would be the same sort of group as the anti-immigration rally slash uh, the rallies from the other weekend, and then um, counter rallies, rally against racism slash sovereignty never ceded. Uh, yeah, I mean, yep, it kind of disappointing this camp sovereignty thing was attacked, and I, yeah, I can kind of see why part of the police say this, but hmm, hmm, I wonder who's going to do what. I also think that, again, the actions of or what's taken place in the last 36 hours, well, really in the last 12 hours, is going to start potentially pushing people away from supporting leftist ideologies, or it's going to start people realizing that the rhetoric that is being pushed has led to violence and does lead to violence, and that the violence being carried out is not what people are saying or where they're saying, and that there are a whole bunch of voices out there that seem to do nothing but beat war drums of war, yet hide behind protection as soon as someone challenges them for their accountability, that probably shouldn't be listened. I mean, it's been said before, social media is the worst thing to have happened to society in some respects. But hey, we'll see. So yeah, I mean, see what happens coming this weekend. I think, whilst I think the more leftist protests should shrink back, should walk quietly for a little while, do I think that's going to happen? No. No, I do not. And the reason I think that is because a lot of rhetoric and stuff seems to be coming from people who never believe in the consequences of their own actions. Yeah. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Okay. Uh, Israel. Well, yes. Actions of Israel. So their strike into Qatar was, I talked about it as being a bit like the strikes into Mozambique when Rhodesia was undergoing its fight for or against independence, and how there was a feeling by the Rhodesian forces that their operations were being leaked ahead of time by the British Foreign Office to the leadership of ZANU, um, which was the group that Mugabe headed up at the time, and then they merged, or another group merged with them, and they became ZANU PF. But he, at the time, headed up a very Marxist, I think, is the correct um, ideology to identify. They were very much a left wing, very much militant and violent, and used their ability to have safe havens within Mozambique to conduct cross-border raids, attacking not only white farmers and population of Rhodesia, but also the indigenous populations, the Africans that worked for them or worked with them. And there's some really quite brutal incidents where um, these cross-border raids into Rhodesia targeted nothing but um, the black community, and those sort of things got sort of ignored by the broader world community. But the point being that the British Foreign Office was suspected of leaking to Mugabe when these sort of raids, and not just him, but other equivalent leaders at the time, when these raids were coming. And therefore, they were able to leave their strongholds and their safe bases when the attacks came in. So, when Israel struck Qatar, where the leaders of Hamas were, okay, I won't say believed, pretty much acknowledged to be living, and they managed to miss the leaders but catch a bunch of lower level functionaries, quite reasonably the assumption is that somebody told them. Now, Israel said that they told the US and Qatar ahead of time that these attacks were incoming, and hence the question about how Israel could strike high security neighborhood is because, well, the US and Qatar kind of went, yep, we know it's coming. But the subsequent guesstimate would be that somebody leaked that information down to Hamas, and as a result, the leaders were like, yeah, time to step out for a bit. And so the 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 issue is, I mean, people were like, well, people are uninformed about how this sort of stuff is like, well, how did they manage to overcome air defenses and stuff? Well, when Israel struck the nuclear reactor sites in Iraq and Syria and things like that. They kind of coordinated ahead of time. Well, when they struck the Iraqi ones, they coordinated with the Syrians to allow overflight. They coordinated with Lebanon as well. When they struck the Syrian targets not long ago, they coordinated with the Russians, who were providing most of the Syrian air defences. So it's a case of very rarely will they go ahead with a completely solo attack that is not known about by at least somebody. Now, when they were rattling sabers at Iran before the recent attacks against Iranian assets, there were a number of Gulf states who said, yes, we will give you permission to overfly us if you're going to attack Iran, which is basically saying, look, you tell us you're coming, we'll look the other way because we don't like them either, and we can't hit them like you can, and we don't want the bad blood that we already have. So people say, well, how could this have happened? Well, it could have happened because they coordinated, and that's kind of how things happen. That's how it works. Now, how the leadership escaped is probably because somebody told them. Again, it happens. If you have to tell somebody it's coming, you have to expect that they're probably going to tell somebody else. But was it helpful? No, not really. I mean, had they managed to hit the actual Hamas heads, there might be a slight different outcome. But is there? I mean, the fact they missed has probably damaged their standing again, and removed any goodwill they had from suppressing Iran. And um, they also carried out an attack into Yemen overnight, targeting Houthi sites. So the the goodwill, I mean, the fact that they can't reach a ceasefire with Gaza also meant their goodwill was rapidly evaporating. But any goodwill I think that Israel retained post the Iran attacks, I think has largely gone as a result of the attacks in Qatar and now Yemen. And so people see it as Israel doing whatever it feels like, whenever it feels like, without consequence. When Trump kind of not berated, I mean upbraided, I think is the word, well, berated uh, the Israeli government for the attacks they launched when it was supposed to be ceasefire against Iran, like within the hours of it ending, of the coming into force. It's one of the few times that Israel has been so openly uh, dressed down, I guess, by the US, or by, I guess, in a way that basically the entire world was like, no, you've overstepped your boundaries. And so, without a corresponding statement again coming out of attacks in Qatar and Yemen, people are just looking at it as, well, Israel's back doing what it kind of always has, which is whatever it feels like, whenever it feels like, and no one's going to pull them up on it. And so, yep, okay, you've got a bunch of people saying, oh no, well, how could this have happened? Well, it happened, and yeah, okay, useless speculation, useless speculation. Um, I mean, they're talking to some professor at a random university saying, oh, it could have been this, it could have been that. Yeah, no, more than likely it was, like I said, and clearly they've had to overfly. Well, Jordan, I doubt they went down the Red Sea and flew over Saudi. I think they came that way down to Qatar. But again, there were people that knew it was coming. People that knew it was coming. And it may have been that because they know the air defense quality of some of these nations, they might have gone Syria, Iraq, Qatar that way, perhaps. Because the Saudis have a fairly good, fairly reasonable air defense system. The Jordanians definitely do. Kuwaitis, not too bad. Um, and the Americans at LUD would definitely have known what was happening. So, uh, yeah, it would have been unlikely they went that way. It wasn't a raid on Entebbe, but um, uh, yeah. Okay, I think it's just people random useless speculation really at the moment. So that was questions over how they did it. Then there was there was only a couple of articles about the attack then in Yemen at the same time. So heavy airstrikes on yesterday. How they conducted it, whether the airstrikes or missile strikes, who knows? But yeah, uh, targeting Houthis for what they did. But I'd expect to see probably some more articles about that. But it's not as interesting as airstrikes in Qatar. Plus, you have more Western media hanging around Qatar, and Al Jazeera is based in Qatar, whereas not too many people are based in Yemen. Okay, so that was Channel 9. There was an article here. Okay, SBS. Now I did know I had it open. Just couldn't find it. Okay, I don't think there's any more Israeli stuff. No. So we've got really two more things to cover after this, and they're the big ones, really. The Going back to the protests planned for Melbourne this weekend. Um, Victorian Police. Well, I found it interesting. I didn't load the article, but I had a look at Crikey this morning, and there was an article on there uh, targeting Victorian, the Victorian justice system, Victorian policing, about the and the Victorian government about the level of crime in Victoria, and sort of as a flow out from the machete death, the deaths of the two African migrant boys over the weekend, and how the solution, which was ineffectual, of we've got machete turn-in bins and that'll obviously take care of it. And so the article was basically targeting the Victorian government and the various aspects of it about being ineffectual on crime, and that they have an apparent unwillingness to confront openly what the issues actually are. That drew some heat in the comments because, well, some people saw it as basically a tabloid type article and sort of slandered it as, oh, that's a right wing take on things. Um, Crikey's not right wing in any way, shape, or form. Some people were like, yeah, no, 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 that's a good take and everything else, but by and large, it was like, don't be targeting our progressive darlings. Um, uh, if Crikey was publishing it, eh, there's a split in the ideology. No true Scotsman. The only person who hates a socialist um, more than anybody else is another socialist. It's it's like they're failing a purity test, and as a result, they're being targeted for not being pure enough. But it doesn't help that then pushes to a more extreme position, more extreme echo chambers, and takes stuff away from it. So anyway, the protest in Victoria, but it seems that it's only Melbourne where there's going to be issues. But yeah, the the confrontation now, like I talked about from the previous conflict on the bridge, where it seemed that it was Antifa were were cruising for a bruising, so to speak. They instigated the conflict, instigated the contact, and resultant beatdown that took place, and how there was an obvious lack of police presence until after a series of beatings were handed out. Yeah, like I said, it was supporting it. It fed into the more extreme right wing narrative of the police were being ideologically driven as well, as opposed to interested about the safety of Australian people, irrespective of who they support. So, yeah, I mean, there's a pretty throwaway statement. But the reason for bringing this article up, as opposed to just deleting it, is because it's SBS. So that brings the focus from, well, again, a very, very progressive viewpoint, leftist. So I'm going progressive, a very leftist viewpoint, and also the viewpoint pertinent to the migrant community of various flavours. And so there were obviously articles saying people felt afraid after the previous parades and things like that. Uh, it's funny that she never said anything about the left-wing protests when that happened. So we'll see. We'll see. I would like to think, though, that there will be a drawdown of the violence. It won't be as violent. Now, I kind of jumped away there for a sec. There was, as I finished up yesterday, I'll come in this way. There's a bunch of articles. So as I finished up yesterday, there were stuff appearing on Twitter mainly to begin with about airfields in eastern Poland shutting down to civilian air traffic due to a sudden military operation. And then there were allegations of the very quick allegations of an airspace incursion by Russian forces. The news disappeared almost as fast as it appeared, which raised questions about what actually took place. Because had it been like an actual attack by Russia against Poland, the news just would have been flooding the zone. There would have been article after article after article. It would have been all over social media, all tons of stuff. It it vanished very, very quickly. And that straight away was like, huh, there's something weird there. They closed the border with Belarusian military exercise going on in Belarus, close to the Polish border. All right, fair enough. And the Polish put their military on higher alert. The imagery, so what is now understood is that there were a number of drones that entered Polish airspace and were subsequently crashed or were shot down, and were shot down by a variety of aircraft. And it resulted in a military aircraft response from, I guess, across Europe, and it also then resulted in the Poles calling for discussion under Article 4 of the NATO agreement as a discussion on what to do next. It's not Article 5, but it's discussion about what to do next. So it's not collective defence just yet. The imagery of the shot down drones or the destroyed drones took almost 24 hours to come out. Took at least 18 hours to come out, and that straight away raises questions about who, what, where, when. And as we were discussing this on the stream last night while I was playing Pillars of Eternity, my party was standing there complaining at me for not moving them while I was chatting to um, one of the viewers on stream who lived in Germany and was concerned about this being an escalation and everybody's afraid of Russia, and not quite at the point people are hiding under their beds, but it certainly seemed not far off. And I said, well, look, the most important thing to do when something like this happens is to sit on your hands and wait. You've seen reports, and that's what they are, they're reports, that something has happened. You need to wait for information to build and for the picture to clear before you can commit to action, or you should commit to action. Now, quite obviously, there people who were responding militarily understood what was going on, at least thought they understood what was going on. What is not in what is not in dispute is that there was a penetration of Polish airspace by a number of drones that were then shot down or crashed. Okay, that much is accepted truth. The allegation, which seems to be the case at the moment, is that they were Russian origin. Now, launched by Russia. The so that's the so now we're heading into speculative territory. We're moving away from fact into speculation. Supporting the idea that they were Russian in origin is the markings on the shot down drones, which suggests a Russian origin. The fact that there were Shahed drones involved, which the Russians have acquired from Iran and are using as well. And um, the, there are a couple of other elements that were strongly suggestive of them being Russian in origin. Okay, what is still unknown is who launched them and where they were launched from. Now, it's possible that there were nations in the area who had a very clear picture as to what was going on. I saw in the initial reporting that it was the Ukrainians who said, "Oh, these bad things are coming for Poland." That's I disbelieve that. Poland has, and then someone saying, "Oh, it was an attempt to test Polish air defences." I also don't believe that. Poland has some very well established and well publicised systems, air defence systems within their borders, and there's probably very little interest from anyone to test them. Plus, they're an active member of NATO, and it would be expected that any substantive attack would draw substantive response. So I think the claim that it's an attempt to test Polish air defences can be dismissed quite readily. The imagery that I saw of the drones that were shot down were of a class that people called a decoy drone. It's a non-munition carrying drone, or wasn't carrying any munitions at all. And the explanation about it being a decoy drone is that they launch a whole bunch of non-munition carrying drones to overwhelm the existing air defense system, basically force the air defense systems to engage, run out of ammunition, etc., or force them to try and pick out of a swarm which ones are carrying munitions and which ones aren't, and basically induce doubt as to what's going on. And then there's a greater chance that the drones carrying weaponry can get through and get to their targets. So they're a decoy in terms of drawing attention away and assets away from those carrying weapons. The fact it was apparently only decoy drones that entered Polish airspace, okay, I mean, but there was a Shahed drone. The Shahed drones definitely carry weapons. Munitions were the ones that overflew Poland carrying it. That information I haven't seen, and I don't know if it's been published anywhere. So the question is, why was it only decoy drones, or the drones that people have identified so far? Why have they only been decoy drones? Is it possible that these drones could have reached Poland from Russian territory? Well, yeah, apparently the closest point of Russian territory to the points of entry is only about 68 k's, and some of these systems have hundreds of Ks, potentially thousands of Ks of range. All right, fair enough. So it's entirely possible it could have launched anywhere uh, from where it entered back into Russia. All right, okay, fair enough. The next question is, were they intentionally targeting Polish airspace, or was it, okay, if we're assuming that they were Russian launched, was it potentially an error in setup? Were they misdirected for some particular reason? Was it a navigation failure on the drones? Did they fail in some way and therefore get misdirected? Okay, so that's kind of the most likely explanation if we're going for a Russian launch, that for whatever reason they missed whatever they were targeting in Ukraine and ended up flying on into Poland. Not the first time in history that aircraft have done something like that, or unmanned aircraft have done that. The US lost drones over Afghanistan that were alleged to have flown into Iran because of the loss of control of the drone. Uh, yeah, not the first time that's happened in a conflict zone. Is it? Did the Iranians regard that as an attack by the US against them? No, they were quite happy to pick up the pieces, apparently. Um, at least that's alleged to what's happened. So it's potential. I mean, it might have only taken, given the distances involved, it might have only been like a 5 or 10 degree error in heading, and you end up in Poland as opposed to Ukraine. And I mean, that could also be change in wind conditions. It could be a change in atmospherics. There's any number of reasons you could have a lateral error like that. Now, I'm guessing that the weapon carrying systems they're a little bit more careful with. The other part of it is the alternate is that they were launched by Ukraine from captured down drones that had been shot down or forced down or captured intact inside Ukraine, and that they were then launched by Ukraine as an attempt to escalate things. Okay, that requires a bit more evidence and a bit more, um, well, quite a lot more evidence in order to support the claim. But it's not out of the realm of possibility. Last time that a missile entered, well, when there were missiles flying over Polish territory and landing in Polish territory before, it was initially blamed on the Russians, but it was found to be, based on the photos, because it was pretty evident from the photos who owned the missile initially, that it had been a misfire from inside Ukraine. Well, an alleged misfire. Now, it's entirely possible the operator punched in the wrong heading and it flew off 180 degrees out of whack. It could have been the inertial systems, if they had inertial systems, weren't spun up and balanced properly, and therefore it was out of control from the moment it was launched. Could have been a whole bunch of reasons as to how it was fired from Ukrainian territory and landed in Poland. But you go with the most basic expectation, which is it was an error. Because if it was not an error and it was an intentional act, then that starts talking about intent and what the intended action or the intended outcome of such actions were, of why one belligerent is trying to draw NATO in, um, and it's not the one that people are expecting. So the fact that the articles appeared and disappeared very quickly suggested that there were nations or organizations out there that very clearly understood where these drones originated from and what they were doing and what they were carrying. The military response to force them down, yep, fair enough, that's going to happen. But talking to some of the Europeans yesterday, they were like getting scared about all this and that it's Russia pushing for escalating things. And it's like, well, where are you getting that from? And it's like the media saying it. And it's like, well, okay, again, it appeared then disappeared from the news very quickly, which suggests that there are people higher up in some of these systems that have a very clear understanding of what's actually taken place. And whilst they're not sharing that information openly, because that will then expose their gathering capabilities, they're tamping down the response because they have a better understanding of what actually happened. Now, they don't necessarily know exactly why it happened, but at least they can have a clearer picture as to, oh, right, yep, no, we got a pretty good idea. Maybe even the Russians, if they had done it by error, might have reached out through a secure channel and said, look, these were an accident. We're not going to say it openly, but these were an accident. It's quite possible. That sort of stuff will unlikely to ever be shared openly. Be nice if it was. That way we can understand what's going on. But yeah, probably not going to get shared. The whole reporting initially that, oh no, it was the Ukrainians that discovered it and alerted everybody. I don't believe that. I don't believe the Ukrainian air defense systems are that good compared to, well, some of the other systems there in the region that are providing targeting and target identification. Well, actually, no. They may not be providing targeting. That would be an escalation that the Russians would be aware of. Certainly providing information. So yeah, I reckon some of those other systems had a very clear picture and were probably well alerted. And so Ukraine rushing to blame Russia in this and Russia that is another suggestion that maybe the line we're being fed isn't quite what happened. Maybe. We don't know. And I doubt we're ever going to find out. So, yeah, so obviously people rushing. I mean, the BBC here is going to be taking a particular stance. Um, Dutch F-35s helped Poland, so that's where the German people were saying they heard aircraft screaming overhead. Um, Russia saying that that it wasn't deliberate. Okay, but again, think I think this reading between the lines is saying that if it was Russian in origin, it was an accident. It was unintentional. Uh, but you're hearing this rhetoric of sabers being rattled and everything else. Um, People who are a long way from having their blood spilled in conflict feel comfortable pushing inflammatory rhetoric when, again, the last big set of weapons dropped on Poland came out of Ukraine. So it's, I mean, and that statement there is kind of telling as well, because it means that there are information channels that are open and information is flowing that isn't being shared, that is quite clearly de-escalating and or providing context as to what took place that is not being seen. And that that may be very, very likely. And yep, the difficulty with proving intention, GPS spoofing, I doubt that. Um, this is a very sensible statement, though. A caution against drawing conclusions based on snippets of information because it can lead to conclusions or lead to the incident appearing that something it is not. Okay? Ease the rhetoric off. Ease the rhetoric off. So, um, it's it's yeah. I mean, they're talking here obviously about them clearly being non-weapons carrying. Mm, interesting. I mean, obviously people are going to learn from it and there's certainly going to be lessons learned from all of it. I'm surprised though that an AIM-120 can target, so the AMRAAM missiles that we use to help shoot them down. I'm surprised that an AIM-120 is capable of targeting something as small as a drone, and that they didn't engage with guns and things. So that would have been interesting. Um, uh, yeah, uh, but it's what's not being said in articles like this that makes me think that the the, there aren't very many clean hands in this. Okay, so that was SBS talking about accidental or deliberate. Um, okay, so that was the article I just looked at. So, yep, Poland quite clearly shot down the drones after airspace incursion. So we're seeing pictures now of what some of the drones, the the again, I don't know how reliable information like this is. They're obviously trying to say that, yep, I mean, that's not a continuous track, despite what it appears. That implies greater reliability or greater information accuracy than is probably actually possible. Now, it's possible these ones here that went into Poland had overflown. I mean, it certainly looks like they've just continued on past the target. Sometimes that happens. Um, but yeah, it, 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 it's worth seeing and waiting. Uh, yeah, there was obviously another big attack with various missiles and drones as well elsewhere. I mean, there you go. This is misleading by the BBC because, okay, we're talking Russian did this, Russia did that, and then they're slamming this in between without saying who did it. And so the assumption you take away is, oh, that was Russia that did it, but it was a the missile that dropped and killed the farmers came from Ukraine. So yeah, it's clear the BBC has a well has a slant on what is going on. Okay, yep, the Russian airstrike's big enough. Uh, yeah, okay. So it was an Iskander. It's not an ICBM. It's an IRBM, if anything. I, or I mean, even a cruise missile. What's the? I don't think anyone's in denial that Russia struck the building and that there were missiles and Iskanders and Kinzhals and various drones. Don't. I don't see it. I mean, yeah. I mean, they're beating their chests about how good they were at not finding it, doing things. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, the one there's one here that stands out, and it's because of the muddiness of reporting. There's been a lot of claims. I'm very cautious to accept the statements on this. Um, the Because of things like, oh, the Russians pulling gold fillings from the teeth of Ukrainians, when that turned out to be a Ukrainian dentist's personal stash. But the the correction to the salacious claims, well, it's a lot slower in coming. The Like there was also um, uh, I forget the name of the town, the, but this one, which still I disagree with the reporting on, where there were a number of civilians killed by the Russians as they were pulling out of the town as the Ukrainians approached. And apparently the allegation was the Russians were using food drops or food supply to encourage the civilians into location and then killed them. The reason I don't buy that, particularly, I think it begins with a B. Forget the name of the town, but anyway, the reason I don't buy that argument is, well, yes, the dead civilians were found in the vicinity of Russian rations and food supplies that have been given to the population. All right, yes, but by and large, they were wearing the armbands that the Russians had requested that they wear to identify them as basically non-combatants or people willing to receive supplies from the Russians. But the allegation from Ukraine and Ukrainian supporters was that it was the Russians that killed them on purpose. When the first people in were probably the SBU or people who actually had incentive to kill people with Russian supplied materials, whether or not they knew they were civilians or not. Identified a target that is wearing an armband that's not a Ukrainian armband or one of the Ukrainian coloured armbands, and is carrying supplies that are clearly not supplied by Ukraine or allies, and targets them as a result. That, I think, is a more likely reason for what took place than the Russians bombing the town as they left. Um, I mean, they're both war crimes, but the narrative of one was allowed to run when, I mean, when the claims being made did not stand up to even cursory analysis. But no one's allowed to go in and have a look. No one's allowed to take a second look. And I had someone yelling at me not long ago that the Russians were responsible for it. And I'm like, really? And then once I'd sort of walked them through the incident, even based on the evidence that they'd provided, they realised the holes in their argument and were like, oh, but the Russians are still bad. Okay, well, there's no denying that bad things are going on. You don't need to escalate it with allegations that are unproven because you're now ramping up the rhetoric for greater conflict, for greater violence. That, well, you identify, I mean, if it is your own side doing it, you should stop them doing it because non combatants are dying and suffering as a result. And it's not the first time that Ukrainian supporters have made a claim of military outcome that was later shown to be blatantly false. And the more times it happens, the less trust there is in claims that get made. So, or the more likely it is that what you're hearing is blatant propaganda. And people have sort of forgotten that war brings propaganda on all sides. So, um, it additionally, um, so yeah, the it's saying that they bombed a pension delivery site. Okay, yep, it's potentially something that happened by the Russians, but I can also see, based on similar reports in the past or similarly salacious reports in the past, that people are being very loose with the truth. Sadly, the people are dead. Someone killed them. What I don't buy is the argument someone's giving me as to who killed them and why, because it falls apart often under analysis, under being tested. I haven't had the chance to test this yet, but you've already cried wolf several times. Yet, um, maybe not in this article, it's in one of the other articles. So they say that okay, I think Reuters um, or one of the wire services said, look, yeah, they've been unable to verify what took place. They've been given the images by one side, not been allowed to go and have a look, not been allowed to independently check or verify the incident. And so it's clearly been handed down through a single channel. And, well, a single source reporting is very rarely considered accurate. Sometimes it's the best you can get. Uh, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, they're pushing the narrative again. But funnily enough, the violent attack against a Ukrainian refugee in the US has attracted zero statements from many Ukrainian supporters, which has raised eyebrows around the place. Um, yeah, and I guess it's just sort of showing that Ukraine, all of Ukraine is within reach. I mean, I don't know why people didn't think. I mean, it's like people believe the rhetoric that was given about, oh no, the Russians can't do X or can't do Y. It's not like they've not had long range capabilities. And in fact, part of the German the fear from these German viewers the other night was, oh no, Russia's going to come west. And it's like, if, okay, they've still got capabilities to do that at some point, not a problem. But if that was ever part of the grand plan during the invasion of Ukraine, it would have happened back in 2022 when the initial air defense system and, well, the initial um, military positioning was on a back foot. At no point during that initial phase were these long range systems rolled out, and the capabilities were there. They just weren't being used, which to an outside observer would indicate the intent for a more limited set of objectives. And so we talk through the whole pathway from 2014 or even before 2014 about, but from 2014 on about how Euromaidan kind of forced the hand of the political swing in Ukraine, which often swung pro-EU to pro-Russia, back and forth, back and forth. But the interpretation of pre-2014 Ukraine was that it was one of the most corrupt states in Europe, if it was considered part of Europe, and that there was a lot of human trafficking and other rather horrible things that came out of the nation, which by rights is only a relatively new nation, having achieved independence in the early 90s. And, well, yep, there's a lot of nations that were once part of the USSR or part firmly under the sphere of the USSR who quite rightly have a well entrenched dislike of Russia and its interests. And the but what I was pointing out was the context of the Ukrainian people, that there are large sections of the Ukrainian population that see themselves more closely aligned with Russia than with Europe. Now, there's also population within Ukraine that sees itself far more closely aligned with Europe than with Russia. And the whole point of Euromaidan was, hey, we're giving people their voice and allowing them to make a decision and force, well, a corrupt Russian aligned leader out. And we went through how, yeah, okay, that's fine. Now, how much Euromaidan might have been influenced, shall we say, by Western interests, by certain Western interests, yeah, probable. Euromaidan still happened. But then started talking about how almost immediately problems started. The idea of watching Ukrainian parliamentarians taking oaths of loyalty on the edge of the the roof of the building almost at gunpoint, it sort of raises the question how much coercion was involved. What would happen if somebody had refused? Would they be pushed off the edge? What was to happen? There was, I mean, there was still coverage of the violence and the deaths in the Union Hall in Odessa, where it seemed that the outcomes of Euromaidan weren't uniformly welcomed. Um, there had been articles when Euromaidan was underway about how some of the shooting that had taken place by Ukrainian police slash forces towards the Euromaidan protesters was actually a two-way shooting range. Yet those articles disappeared rather quickly because it didn't support the narrative at the time. And if we were to accept that Euromaidan was the will of the people that desired a closer um, ties to Europe, and that, yep, okay, that's fine, then we should also accept the will of the people in in Eastern Ukraine, who saw themselves as more Russian or with closer ties to Russia, and that it was inconsistent to say we accept one group of people's attempts to form a national identity and direction, but deny another when they're from nominally the same nation, to indicate that, hey, maybe this push for closer European ties is not universally welcome within the nation. And so, coming out of Euromaidan, when Luhansk and Donetsk basically went, look, we're not happy with those outcomes, we'd rather stick closer to Russia, thank you. It then led to basically a low-grade civil war from then on. There's obviously a lot of rhetoric that subsequent elections and votes and statements and stuff like that, well, from the Western side of things, there was like, well, no, they're invalid. Well, because to accept their validity would be to accept the validity of the position of those peoples. And you could then argue that the whole Euromaidan is invalid under the same process. But the attempts by Donetsk and Luhansk in particular to forge independence, to basically seek the protection of Russia, they declared their independence and Russia went, okay, we acknowledge it, you're independent. We see you as an independent state. That didn't send shockwaves through Europe like it should have, or through the West like it should have, because you had a large neighbour quite willing to, and Putin gave them security guarantees at the time. Now, the idea of the green helmeted people being Russians, not being Russian, quite possible. I mean, were there troops coming across the border providing support? Again, quite possible. It's certainly no different to a lot of actions that other nations did in Syria or Iraq or other places globally. But once Russia had acknowledged their attempt for independence, it was giving validity to the idea that these people didn't want the European alignment that the other part of the population did, and that because of the attacks against them since 2014, they were being militarily violently suppressed. So it should have come as no surprise that Putin then developed his casus belli from basically the independence. Now, he'd been saying all along, look, stop picking on this um, Russian minority within, or majority of those regions. Stop picking on these regions that want to be more closely aligned with Russia. It took years before he got to the point of invasion. but it seemed like people more aligned with the Western focus of the rest of Ukraine was like, no, we'll never suffer consequences for what we're doing. Come 2022, Russia delivered those consequences. And whilst there was the initial feint towards Kiev and everything else, I'm still of the opinion that Russia has pretty much got the terrain it was after. It's got the regions of Ukraine that it had initially set out to occupy and provide defence to, and you look at what they've done since, how they've dug in and provided massive defence in depth, and how they've not since made a push across the plains to the Dnieper River or further on. It seems they've been quite content to sit tight. Now, how that is waved away by other people is, I know Russia's taken 1 million casualties. Well, if that's the truth, the standing strength of the Russian army slash military, well, I think of all aspects of the Russian army at the start of the conflict was only 1 million people. So I'm to believe the argument, they want you to believe the argument that the entire strength at arms of the Russian army has been destroyed at least once over. Well, if that's the case, Zelensky should be dipping his toes in the Barents Sea, in the Bering Strait, because Russia should have nothing left to prevent a Ukrainian response. So that immediately should raise doubt about the accuracy of those figures. I mean, just straight observation of movement of the front line indicates that that's not the case. And the reality is that, yep, there is a generation being bled into the soil of Ukraine, um, largely a generation of Ukrainians. Even if a peace agreement was to be reached immediately, I think the demographic damage to Ukraine has happened. It's going to take probably close to a century for it to recover, if at all. You look at the population histograms of the Ukrainian population, and you can see the the damage to it in the last 3 years, both by people leaving the country as refugees normally or migrants, um, and the loss of those in conflict. There's a lot of damage that hasn't come to the fore yet. That hasn't been. It'll take years to show up. And for what? For what purpose? I mean, yep, okay, people are unhappy with what Russia did, but Russia was unhappy with what took place. And it's almost the Gaza-Israel problem. Every time you say, well, why did you do this? Well, I did this because they did that. Okay, you go and ask them, why did you do that? Oh, I did that because they did this. And you sort of walk this constant back and forth, back down time. At some point, you've got to draw a line in the mud or the sand and say, look, stop. Yes, clearly there's aggression and belligerence and all that stuff on both sides. But at some point, you've got to either accept the losses or find some other way to deal with it that's not military, because the populations cannot sustain the rate of loss. And I think as it continues to go on, the Ukrainian position gets weaker as more of the population's bled into the soil, and the supplied equipment isn't necessarily the great be all and end all that people are claiming. And I think that's also sent a shock through Western militaries as well, is that a lot of the equipment that was, maybe not openly, but sort of designed to take on uh, the Russians, has not been as successful in application as people assumed. And that Russia has also achieved an odd objective of almost emptying the Western military supply and supply line, not supply lines, but supply systems. And people say, well, no, 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 that weakens us and the Russians can run over us. Well, if they were going to do that, they would have done it 3 years previously. There's very little chance of them doing that now unless there's a complete collapse of the Ukrainian front. Are you trying to tell me that the Ukrainian front is about to collapse? Well, possible. I still don't see the Russians running west. I don't see them wanting Kiev, based on what Putin said. And you can look at um, South Ossetia and see where Putin's, I mean, maybe people may not like him, but he's largely kept to what objectives he set to go and do, which is why I think at the moment I don't see, uh, I don't see Ukraine's position getting any stronger. I mean, the rhetoric aside, arguments screaming otherwise, it doesn't help. Nope, doesn't help. They're articles that don't help. Um, they're just to wind people up. Again, pictures of small drones, etc. Yep, okay. No, nothing new. I've seen a photo from inside that. There's actually an intact drone in there with a clear tail number marking. I don't think that dude's a firefighter, but we'll see. Um, it's. I mean, I don't like the rhetoric and things like that of faith in the reliability of the alliance has been shaken under President Trump, who, alongside key cabinet members, called on Europe to lead in its own defence. Initially, Trump just wanted other NATO members to commit to the defence expenditure that they were obliged to be part of NATO. And now there's a bit of a whinge of you expect us to look after our own defence. Can't have it both ways. So, yeah. And yeah, obviously Zelensky's stirring the pot. And yeah, it's, I mean, is there a scale to tell us how far it zoomed in? I mean, I, I don't agree necessarily that. I don't think it was necessarily an intentional act. Like I said, I think there was enough information through other channels to de-escalate the situation down from what it could have been. And I mean, yep, they shot down things. So, yep, obviously more stuff off the wires again. Um, yeah, well, yeah, I again, it's going to probably fade away to nothing in a couple of days, to be honest. But the scary thing on top of all of that is the, let me see, is there anything else? Yep. Okay. Is there anything else? Yeah. So it was brought up as well by the Germans that, oh no, we've been under attack with our power infrastructure and stuff as well. Reuters. So it's not like Pravda or some other, well, Reuters does have a slant, but there was a suspected arson attack in Berlin that left like 50,000 homes without power. The the claim, though, was that it was from a far left. Here we go. Okay, I'll make it bigger so people can see that it was a far left militant group calling itself Volcano Group, and it was targeting Tesla's expansion attempts to build a factory or distribution center, uh, development center, um, in Berlin or Germany, and so they've attacked the power infrastructure to try and, well, send a message, I guess, against it. And but the claims that other people were making was that it was the Russians doing it, it was Russian drones doing this, Russian drones doing that. And so you've got this misinformation that is allowed to spiral up and spool up and be spread because people can't control themselves about the reporting or what's going on elsewhere. And they've assigned blame in a location that may not be. Now, it's basically these groups claiming that they've done it. Again, you take it at face value, but I mean, I don't know what Focus Online is like as a source, but they had a more in-depth article about uh, the attack and who claimed it and where they made the claim from, and again that it was linked to. And so use a couple of sources, but it's hard to find this out. Very few articles covered it. I saw it in passing yesterday, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting because it was a left-wing, militant left-wing group that was claiming it. When a lot of the rhetoric is it's all a fault of the right. Now, rhetoric and left and right and left and right and left and right. Okay, um, we now move into, I guess, probably the biggest thing that took place today and has prompted all sorts of outpouring and stuff like that. So, uh, Turning Point Media, Charlie Kirk. Uh, yeah, we don't want to watch that. Nope, 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 nope. That's a video. Um, and I mean, there's footage of him being shot. So basically, you don't want to give me the article. Okay, so it says MAGA activist Charlie Kirk. Okay, so Charlie Kirk was a conservative commentator. He had okay, yep, you've cut me off. Well, goodbye, Sydney Morning Herald. Um, okay, so yeah, he was a media pundit. He sort of rose through independent media, had his own podcast and everything else. And what he would used to do was, and I'm sure people have seen the online memes of a guy sitting behind a desk with a microphone and a sign taped to the front saying "Change my opinion." That was what Charlie Kirk did. He went out to universities, colleges. He went out in the public and basically asked people to come and talk to him and to change his opinion on things. So he was obviously presenting a right-leaning conservative opinion on issues, social issues, economy, military, the whole gamut. But he wanted to have people come and talk to him because, well, challenge his opinion, challenge his point of view. Is it possible that what he was believing and spouting was wrong? Give him a better argument and he'll follow it. And so it was also done to try and, share his point of view with the person he was debating with to try and find out, well, are you arguing from a point of accuracy? Are you just relying on hearsay, or are there facts that I can use to improve or change my position? And so it'd be like change my mind. And so over time, he got more and more attention, and would it became a bit more of an organised thing. Like he'd have his little tent set up, and he'd sit there, and he'd have a mic set up, and people would line up and challenge him on various issues, and they'd have a debate. And in in general, there was no violent rhetoric. He only chose to engage through debate, and only with people who were willing to talk to him. He gave people the floor to explain their position and to try and change his mind, um, which is the sort of interaction you want to have when you're talking about politics or those sort of things, because it it's a sign of an open mind that, well, maybe the position I believe in isn't the best one, Maybe there's better positions. Maybe both sides are wrong, and we can improve what we believe and why we believe it. And I don't recall seeing or hearing him shout down the opposition or protesters and things like that. And because he rose out of the social media space, he certainly took a more prominent role in Donald Trump's second election to the presidency. And yep, I mean, there'd been threats made against him previously, like there were campuses, college campuses, where they were not able to set up after previously having had permission to do so. And wasn't the case they just arbitrarily went onto campuses and set up. They apparently sought the appropriate permissions and everything else, and especially later on as it attracted mass audiences. I mean, you see the footage surrounding the shooting today of how many people were attracted to hear him talk, and not necessarily hear him talk, but hear him debate, and to listen to what other students and other people who weren't him had to say, and to hear this exchange of ideas that had been brought to them. And so, yeah, he was obviously heavily involved. I mean, he was only fairly young, 31, and sadly he was shot in the neck um, by a fairly long range, well, it wasn't someone standing next to him with a handgun. He was shot from a distance, shot through the neck, and initially was believed to have survived the shooting, but subsequently the news was updated to say that he'd passed away. And quite reasonably, it has drawn outrage from those on the conservative side, plus some on the left. There'd been a lot of rhetoric, and usually from the left, that the election of Trump was going to lead to right-wing death squads, that there's going to be a dictator locking up and executing the gays, or all sorts of insane statements like that that had no bearing in reality. Um, well, we're quite delusional, to be quite honest. And the the evidence, I mean, people said, look, if there are right-wing death squads roaming the streets, people would know about it. It would be impossible to keep that sort of thing under wraps in the US. I mean, if that was the case and the right wing controlled thought and stuff like that, we'd see a very different social media. We'd see a very different online presence for a lot of people, and they're like, "Oh no, we're fighting the right, fighting for the good fight." But most of the mass media leans left. Most of the major newspapers lean left. Most of the online social media sites lean left. Up until Elon Musk bought Twitter, it was, well, it was suspected, but proven after he bought it, that conservative voices were being suppressed. And not just being suppressed, but often suppressed in coordination with other social media sites, or sometimes even in coordination with the government. And those with leftist voices largely ignored the authoritarian nature of that, and will often celebrated it, pretending that because there were no conservative voices, or very few conservative voices, it meant that their ideology was the correct one, that it was winning the day, that they had this progressive wonderland. But the reality being that the government wasn't producing it, wasn't providing it. If anything, um, there was a very ineffectual delivery of things, and that there are many, many opportunities where Trump could have gone gloves off and brought the hurt down. And people said that was the case when he activated the National Guard to protect federal agents in Los Angeles and things like that. Yet the court system has kind of backed his approach on it. And as we had a look at the article the other day, despite everyone saying he's authoritarian, they have to accept and admit that he is only exercising the powers that have already been granted to the president. He is not overstepping his bounds. He just may be using them in a way that voices on the left don't agree with. And it's like people who are like, I know right-wing death squads, this and that. They almost forget the history of what left-wing death squads have done, of what socialist uh, militantism and militancy has achieved, and that you can stir hatred through speech just as much as you can by giving someone a gun and pointing them in a direction. But whenever it happens, they wash their hands and look in the other direction. Um, that things that they latch onto, which seem to fall through because they're ideologically driven or they push an outcome. It's like saying that the thing that killed BLM more than anything else was the introduction of body cams because, well, the left argued for it because I know it's going to prove that the cops are racist and all cops are bastards, etc. But what it showed was that by and large, the police interaction with the black community and with minority communities was appropriate, or if anything, it was very soft-handed. It was just that these instances of um, violent outcomes were few and far between, and that the narrative beforehand had glossed over key elements of the incident, of key facts, and left left things to be. And you look at where political violence actually has come from, where who'd led riots. Now, you look at, say, um, Kyle Rittenhouse. Okay, he was a conservative individual who shot three people at a series of riots in Kenosha. The Kenosha Kid, as people might say. Now, there are still people out there today who believe that he shot three black men, when the truth, as captured on uh, from various video sources and as found through the subsequent court case, was that he fired in self-defense, and that the people who he ended up killing and shooting were not the sort of people that you wanted to put at the forefront of an organization or of an ideology as to hold up as good character examples. But that was allowed to be hidden and suppressed from the narrative, and that the violence in the streets of Seattle and Portland and places like that, where um, not so much Proud Boys, I mean, they were a weird organisation as they were, where they came under attack through street violence, and you had the running battles on the streets, and unarmed battles, and people hitting each other with skateboards and bike locks and things like this, where uh, people were emboldened to violence because they believed the rhetoric that they were morally right. They weren't necessarily right, but they believed in that they were going to be held up as some sort of moral victor, and that their commitment to violent action was justified. And the fact that the opposing viewpoint was being suppressed in the media and on social media and things like that only further encouraged it. If we're to be brutally honest, what we've seen in the last probably decade plus or so is that political violence is driven from the left. There are, to be honest, examples of political violence coming from the right. No one should deny that. But the predominant street level violence that's coming out and is from the left. There were there were at least two assassination attempts against Trump during the election. One of whom that, but for Trump turning his head, would have killed him. The second one is currently going through court at the moment and is elected to represent himself. But you had these individuals who believed the rhetoric given to them from the left. I mean, even the one that winged Trump, there's still debate as to who that individual was, because there was identification of a person who'd gone to fight in Ukraine because they'd followed this leftist thing. But the weird thing is, like everyone's saying Nazi and fascist as some means to decry anyone slightly to the right of Mao, falls flat. It's like it's a means to discredit. Yet you ask them to define what it means to be fascist, what exactly that person is doing that is fascist in action or belief or thought. They can't do it. Or that represents National Socialism in action. They can't do it. Now, is there an authoritarian presence to right-wing extremism? Yes. Again, no one's denying that, but it's the blanket painting of any conservative position as extreme that is, I think, finally making people lose their temper and lose their willingness to accept action without consequences. As we saw when that politician got shot in the west of Ukraine, his party that he founded were Nazis. Well, social nationalist, NatSoc, and they had very clear Nazi symbology. That particular article and bits of news disappeared very quickly from the news cycle because it didn't fit the narrative of, oh no, there's no Nazis there. It's the other side that are the Nazis and the fascists and everything else. It's the sort of thing that when you look at actual fascists in action, you go back and look at, say, the Spanish Civil War, where you did have um, communists on one side, well, and very much socialists on one side, the international brigades and whatnot, and the fascists on the other. And you look at uh, the abhorrent extremes that both sides engaged in under the banner of their ideology. I'm sure the Catholic Church still hasn't forgiven them for what they did. And depending on how you read into George Orwell's life, his experience there fighting for the international brigades led to him taking the position that led to books like Animal Farm in 1984. And that, as we look at it, um, post World War II, have a look at the violent groups that emerged in Germany and Italy and places like that, Red Hand and groups like that. They were by and large socialist. Now, it could be argued that they'd been receiving funding under the table from the other side of the Iron Curtain as an attempt to destabilize a capitalist economy, governments, etc. And as a result, it met the soft objectives of the Soviet Union. Yep, you could argue that, I guess, maybe. I'm sure someone probably got a PhD out of that. But you look then into, say, the end of the decolonisation of Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but Rhodesia, as Mozambique, Angola, and you look at who was funding and supporting the rebels at the time. So in Angola, it was the Cubans and um, Russians and East Germans and people like that. And there's books written by I think the one that I can think of right now is Agent 47, which was written by a South African woman who all along had been probably ideologically aligned with the ANC, but she initially joined the South African police and had begun, because of her ideological leanings, had sort of led to undercover work. But when the ANC found out what she was doing, it almost led to a very bloody end for her. But that prompted me then to go and have a read up about these prison camps that the ANC and other groups ran over the border in Angola and other places, which then led me to um, uh, Marx International, or the internationalist Marxist groups, that had a, quite a detailed critique, a negative critique of the actions of the ANC and ZANU and various other Marxist and communist rebel groups in southern Africa at the time, about how a lot of the violence they carried out was targeted at fundamentally their own supporters. And that, if anything, they wanted to distance themselves from those actions. But to listen to the rhetoric that flies around the net, it's like, well, no, that that sort of stuff's there. It's like when Antifa or anti-fascist action sort of was recreated or came back into the fore. It wasn't black bloc, but they're probably not far from black bloc anarchism. But it's like people went, oh, well, they fought the Nazis. They must be good, without stopping to consider what Antifa were when they were created, who created them, why they were created, and what they did. If anything, the Nazi attempts to fight them and suppress them before they really took power was quite possibly a good thing. Yet it goes without, like they're going without question, and it's the the idea that uh, not so much there's a creeping socialism, um, but it hides behind a banner of progressivism, and people have managed to identify the term progressive as a positive thing, as meaning a an improvement in condition over time. That's not necessarily the case. It's a bit like environmentalism. Um, Back when I was a kid, was when they introduced the idea of land care into Australia, which was kind of a recognition that a lot of farming practices on marginal farmland were destructive to the environment and leading to the loss of topsoil through water erosion, the formation of gullies where um, creeks and stuff should have been. It led to greater turbidity and issues in the water supply, which meant native um, fish stocks were affected because they couldn't deal with the change of things. It affected waterways, it affected the health of watersheds and water systems, all sorts of bits and pieces. Now, the idea of land care was about responsible stewardship of the land, the idea that you wanted to preserve the viability of the soil and the terrain for future generations and basically for yourself as you continue to farm it, to remediate the damage that the past had caused, be it salinity or other things, protect waterways. It's like a it's like the balance between environmentalism, conservation to sustainability and exploitation. That was the sort of the spectrum we were taught in geography, was environmentalism and conservation. Well, environmentalism was basically remove the humans from the environment and leave it alone as much as possible. Conservation was about responsible protection of the environment and ensuring that the native species and everything else were continuing to live in a healthy manner. Sustainability was about working with the environment to provide agriculture and products that sustained human activity and human life, but did not come at a cost to the environment. That could be carried on indefinitely, basically, and that was what we should be targeting. And then there was just blatant exploitation. But even then, you had people who were hardcore environmentalists. Conservation was, yeah, I mean, seen almost as a step down by them, and they're like, no, 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 it's got to be this. No, 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 it's about responsible stewardship, sustainability, and you carry that across to political speech and things like that. And you go and look again at the rhetoric, even here in Australia, about what happened during COVID and how anybody who was not in lockstep, I've made the statement plenty of times, that people wondered how Nazism was allowed to emerge in Germany when it did. Like, people were like, oh no, I would have stopped that. I would have said no to it. A lot of these people were so quick to John the Jackboot when COVID struck that there are a lot of people who were, I mean, who followed what they were told and didn't stop to think about the consequences or why they were doing what they were told. And that when the opportunity arose for them to suppress others in a politically acceptable manner, that any idea of right or wrong went out the window. And those jackboots got donned so quickly. And then afterwards, as the nuances in the situation became better understood, they pretended that it never happened. Or they pretended that their involvement or the angry rhetoric they shouted online never took place. They absolved themselves of responsibility, which fundamentally doesn't happen. But even then, um, I mean, Victoria is the classic example. They had a very progressive government that fought its own supporters at one point and basically said, "Look, you're not going to the population. You're not going to do anything about it," in slightly different terminology. And but subsequently, the former premier's close alignment with China has now been targeted in his own ideological purity. I mean, at some point, people are hoist on their own petards, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. But sadly, it is this idea of hateful rhetoric under the banner of hidden under the banner of progressivism, which I think has caused the most damage and is causing the most political damage and violence, political violence. And I think there's a lot of reasonable people are going to suddenly wake up one day and realize that they've been following a rhetoric that has led to things that they never wanted to happen. I think there's a lot of very reasonable people out there who follow along quite happily because that's what they've been told is the way it is, because all other voices were suppressed. And so when you have people like Charlie Kirk come along and openly and fairly discuss different ideology and allow people of all parts of the ideology spectrum or banner to voice what they believe in, to have him targeted and shot for attempting to find a middle ground is, well, very, very sad to begin with. But to many, it's indicative of the violence of the left. And at the moment, there is very little that is being done to counter that narrative or to counter that opinion. And people have been building it for a while and they believed it was coming and they can see it. And they're like, well, nope, you guys have done it. It's on your heads now. So, yes, it's sad for his family, young kids. Uh, and yeah, like it says, he's debated with students about issues like transgender identity, climate change, faith, family values, and obviously Trump saw him as a voice for the sort of conservative issues that Trump believed in. And so, yeah, it's to promote, well, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. Okay, traditionally Republican values, I guess. Um, it he was probably one of the least divisive people out there, and was willing to go and talk and listen. So, okay, people might have felt aggrieved at the fact he didn't espouse transgenderism and had a counter skepticism or had skepticism over COVID-19, which is fine. Okay, false claim. Okay, again, that's a rhetoric being pushed. You get it. If you're unwilling to look at the evidence that has been brought forward and I guess even look at the voting patterns between 2020 and 2024, you you're not going to be convinced otherwise, and that's fine. You can continue to believe that, but understand that it is a belief. At the end of the day, Biden was appointed as the president by the electors, by the panel of electors. So according to the political system in the US, Biden was the 46th president. And that was he at that point. You can't say he was illegitimate. Now, how the electors got to be there, that's where everybody's having where the issues arise. But it'd be wrong to say Biden was illegitimate. He was no, he was appointed by the processes that existed, and he was the 46th president. But the precursor to that, yeah, yeah, it's like people saying the evidence that you see, no, 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 that didn't happen, but it's right there. Nah, that's not what happened. That never happens. Yeah, it's yeah. So sadly, yes, he passed away, um, and there is all sorts of media covering it because, yeah, I mean, I don't want to show the footage of the actual, um, yeah, this is just before he was shot, but the entire space he was in was packed with people. People wanted to hear him. People wanted to be there to debate, and yeah, uh, good job, SBS. It's even the actual events around that. I mean, who died on January the 6th? They were Trump supporters. The the Capitol Police that were alleged to have died on January 6th died later, um, mostly by suicide. And yeah, I mean, there were also people shooting state level um, politicians, even judges. There was also the hammer attack against Nancy Pelosi's husband, although I really don't know what the motivation behind that was. That one was weird. Um, this Gretchen Whitmer thing, um, I'm fairly certain that that's been shown to have been an FBI plot, and that, or that it was actually there was a degree of association with that, and it's like um, uh, Kamala Harris's push for outlawing lynching and stuff. Well, lynching was always outlawed; it's murder. But the Juicy Smollett falsification, he's claiming a hate crime that never existed, yet the leftist rhetoric that supported it and slandered anybody who said, "Wait a second, there's big holes in the argument here." Um, that eventually it was shown he was lying. Ha! No, everyone's just moved on. The rhetoric moved on. It's like, oh, no, 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 that's fine. It's like, well, hang on. There was an attempt, there was an alleged attempt to carry out a hate crime that was also driven down political lines. Yet this political violence was falsified. Oh no, it was the what? It was the right that did it. Well, no. But does that stop people still claiming that it took place? And so not only was it falsified by the left, it was there are allegations that Kamala Harris might have had more of a hand in it than appears because she was pushing the anti-lynching bill at the time, and there is imagery of her with Jussie Smollett together in that rough time frame, and so yeah, U.S. politics is a mess. It's a mess. Um, I and you get now people trying to climb down from their positions. It's like no, no, you've done it. You've said it, and um, you, you can't back down from your statement like that. So the sad part of it too is almost immediately there were statements from um, on MSNBC that there was as to what took place, and it's like uh, it well, it beggars belief as to how it could have been done. Um, just trying to find. I mean, I did see it. I can't recall the article on which it is. And now people are like, oh no, it's a bad thing. Own your rhetoric. Accept your responsibility for driving the sort of hatred through speech that has led to it. That uh, yeah, the rhetoric for the last decade was it's the right's fault that things were going to happen. But as it points out, the big history has shown that it's the left that undertook it. And yeah, people are now, oh no, we're pretending that it didn't happen. I I think there's going to be a lot of people who aren't going to back down on this. And yeah, it's, I mean, I don't know if it's going to have, no, not in that article. Yeah, and it's also, I guess, put fear into other conservative commentators that, well, they can be targeted just as much. And it's telling us, well, I mean, who comes out and says things, and it's like, no, if it wasn't for the death, you continue the hateful rhetoric against them. You don't get to suddenly jump on the moral high horse and pretend that you've always supported his ideas. No, 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 no. Does not work like that. And in fact, I did see um, on Twitter someone had put this up, which upset some leftists no end. But take a step back. Why did this phrase get created in the first place? Well, because of Islamic attacks against the Charlie Hebdo officers in France, because they'd published cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, the Islamic Prophet Muhammad. And people felt that those bloody attacks were too far when speech should be protected to a degree. And so, Je suis Charlie. And I don't feel that this is necessarily out of place with what's happened. But it seems funny that they were not funny. It's sad that there are people on the left who can't understand that, in essence, it's almost the same thing. A person was killed because of his speech, and it was not violent, and it was speech that a lot of people didn't necessarily find completely abhorrent. There might have been things in it they were slightly offended by, but by and large, he wasn't advocating eradication of people or anything. And and so the phrase applies almost exactly the same. It's it, almost poetic how neatly it fits, and it's telling how much it has upset some, and not upset them in terms of making them sad, upset them in terms of making them angry because they were like, "Oh, this is our banner." Well, no, it never was. It was the case of everybody who came together to protest the Charlie Hebdo things wasn't left versus right. It was basically in response to militant Islamism. But no, people can't see beyond their own ideology, that anybody who isn't them is against them and must be the other side. Well, he's he's hoping his family at least can find some peace. But I think we're a long way from hearing the end of it. We're a long way from hearing the end of it. Well, that's it for today. We're going to close it out. Like I said, I wasn't initially going to stream today, but I did. Too much happened. There's there's too much that um, could not be not addressed. So we'll call it there. I do plan perhaps on streaming tomorrow. We'll see what happens. Beyond that, it'll be a stream Friday night as well. But yeah, we'll call it there. Look after yourselves, everyone. Stay safe.